I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 41 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the House Order adopted on Thursday, June 23, 2022. Members may participate in person or on Zoom. Today we will be resuming the debate on Mr. Serry's motion with Mr. Godin's amendment and Mrs. Ashton's sub-amendments. I would like to remind you that the committee works in reverse, so we first vote on the sub-amendments moved by Ms. Ashton, then vote on the amendments moved by Mr. Godin, and then we move on to the main motion moved by Mr. Serry. We said that in the last meeting, we said that for technical reasons, we will be adjourning the meeting at the end of our time, but we will resume as if we had simply suspended if we're not done with our discussion. So we left off with Ms. Ashton. I would like to know if sound tests were done. Thank you. Yes, I forgot to confirm. Have online participants done the technical tests? We will suspend quickly to make sure the tests are done. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Because it is indeed very important to proceed with these sound tests to protect our interpreters' hearing health. So as I was saying, we are starting a new meeting as agreed upon, but we are picking up where we left off last time as if we had suspended. So we were discussing Ms. Ashton's sub-amendments. Let me give you some context. Ms. Ashton had moved a first sub-amendment that was voted on to amend Mr. Godin's amendment. Ms. Ashton had moved a second one that amended Mr. Godin's amendment, paragraph 2. And now I ask of you to pay attention. The third sub-amendment proposed by Ms. Ashton was modifying the fourth amendment moved by Mr. Godin, and this is where we were at. So as a reminder, the committee will move on to the clause-by-clause consideration of the bill no later than Tuesday, December 6th at 11 Eastern Time. When we suspended last time, Ms. Ashton had the floor, and we were debating the motion by Ms. Ashton, and Mr. Beaulieu asked for the floor. Go ahead. I think if we start working on December 6th, we won't have the chance to hear our four witnesses, which leaves us with it would only leave us with half an hour each, and I think it's very important to hear from the ministers. I would have loved to hear from the Minister of Official Languages about the Official Languages Health Plan. This weekend, I saw a report in Journal de Montréal that gives examples of people who have difficulty accessing care in French. And this is in hospitals that are recognized under 29.1. This is a status that I'd like to remind everyone about. This is not the same as designated institutions in the Official Languages Act, where we ask that a certain level of service be offered in French when it's relevant. Clause 29.1 gives institutions the right to operate exclusively in English. It allows institutions to hire people who don't speak French. This propagation of English in healthcare in Quebec is because of the Official Languages Act at the federal level. The federal government is funding organizations at a very high level, and they're promoting English everywhere. At the start, there was Alliance Québec that was receiving funding. I'm sorry, Mr. Beaulieu, but can you tell us how this is relevant to Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment? Well, yes, of course. Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment says that the committee shall proceed but with the clause-by-clause consideration of the bill no later than December 6th, and this would restrict our opportunity to hear from ministers and get answers to our questions. I'm explaining to you why this is important, why it's important that we be able to ask ministers our questions, especially the Minister of Official Languages. We need answers. And if we consider that this is a democracy and that parliamentary debates are important, that our decisions should be based on objective information for us to make informed decisions. I think it's essential for us to have the time to proceed with our debates properly. So in this specific case, to set a deadline on December 6th leaves us very little time to hear from ministers. I understand what you're saying, Mr. Beaulieu. But we did all of this in Sub-Amendments 1, where we granted the time and dates to hear from ministers. So we've already debated that. We'll be discussing Mr. Godin's First Amendment later. But yes, but since that time, a meeting has gone by. December 6th is no longer a relevant date. We won't have time to proceed with the necessary meetings. And if I've understood the standing orders, you can't prevent a member from speaking if it's related, even indirectly, to the question. And now the question is about the Official Languages Act, our time for debate, and deadlines to hear from ministers who can answer our questions. So I think it's important. Mr. Beaulieu, I'm letting you talk, but I want you to understand, I don't think we're talking about the same thing. I agree that you're allowed to speak in a debate according to the standing orders, but it has to be related to the topic at hand, even if it's a tenuous connection. But what you're saying is we don't have enough time to hear from ministers. Regardless of what you're saying, is that we've already discussed this when we voted on Ms. Ashton's first sub-amendment. Now we're on the sub-amendment that speaks to the clause-by-clause consideration. Well, yes, but the sub-amendment says that we will proceed with the clause-by-clause consideration no later than December 6th. So I'll explain to you why we need more time to hear from the ministers before we get to the clause-by-clause consideration. The clause-by-clause consideration will not be entirely predetermined, I hope. I think that we'll all be acting in good faith and that we'll be able to debate and that our arguments will actually be heard. Because this is a public debate. We're providing information to the public. I think that if the majority of Quebecers and Francophones outside of Quebec understood the importance of this debate, they would understand the importance of proceeding with the clause-by-clause consideration once we've taken the time to proceed with a proper debate. An in-depth debate that we proceed with properly. It's worth doing this well. So to come back to what I was saying, this healthcare plan on official languages in Quebec is something that is misunderstood. I think it's been presented in a hypocritical way. We're always talking about official language minority communities. In Quebec, this refers to Anglophones. So here, in the end, the Anglophone majority in Canada has unilaterally decided that Anglophones in Quebec are a minority and deserve to receive federal funding. I think this is indecent. Anglophones in Quebec especially used to be the elite, especially in the 60s. They had overfunded institutions, and in the case of healthcare, it's become such a hot topic issue. It's become so big, it's hard to get access to healthcare in French. It happened to me. I went to the Maisonneuve Hospital in Rosemont, and I was waiting for my eye exam, and the specialist that appeared didn't even speak French. She couldn't even say hello. And then she asked me to read the letters in English. I could have done it, but on principle, I find it unacceptable. So I waited longer. Then the ophthalmologist came and took his time to do the exam, and I asked if this was normal to have a unilingual employee. And then they say it's not an employee, it's an intern, but the intern was providing the service of the eye exam. And this was not a long time ago. It was a month ago. In the Journal de Montréal, other examples were cited that were much more grave than this. One woman went to the ER with her son and was met with a doctor that didn't speak French, and he sent her back home. I'm convinced that she said that she wasn't convinced that the doctor understood how much pain her son was in. So she had to wait until there was a shift change to be able to speak to someone in French and also make a complaint. This ER doctor that spoke French sent this son to get treatment immediately. He had appendicitis, and his appendix had burst. It was an urgent situation. So these people's health was in danger. Again, we have nothing against Anglophones in Quebec and them being able to access care in English, just like Francophones outside of Quebec should be able to access care in French. But I have questions for the minister. I hope we'll be able to discuss this in the clause by clause, and I hope that we'll be able to ask questions of the minister. We need to think about all of the positive measures and that Quebec should be consulted and that they would have the final say about positive measures, because in some cases I find that these are negative for French and have been going on for 52 years. So I think these measures, this funding from the federal government is what I want to talk about in the clause by clause, and I want the ministers to be able to answer our questions before we get there. They should be able to explain this to us. If we think about the healthcare plan for French, I have some data here. I think they're general numbers. So health in French represents only a small portion. But then there are organizations here, Ami Québec and others. We have nothing against these organizations receiving funding for mental health in English. But why would there be special funding only for Anglophones? This is something that I find unacceptable. If we think about the Community Health and Social Service Network, they've received $65 million since 2010. That's a lot of money, and for what? In each region in Quebec where it's difficult to get service in French, this is happening in all the hospitals. People have spoken out about this. A man had gone to a hospital with his mother. It was also at Maisonneuve Rosemont, and he was unable to access care in French.
That is why I want to have the clause-by-clause consideration. Thank you very much. I'm not sure that this discussion of health and I think Mr. Beaulieu is in agreement with what we discussed last week, where the Bloc MP from Joliette said that the Bloc was just filibustering to prevent the discussion of this. Thank you very much. With regard to the Minister of Justice and provincial and your personal testimony, if I may finish this, I'm a bit confused with regard to the clause-by-clause consideration, the amendment from Ms. Ashton. I think it's the Minister of Health for Quebec who would be a better place to answer questions. This shows how important it is to have an in-depth discussion, because what you're dealing with here in this law, what we're dealing with, is the federal measures, not the provincial government. And this is coming from Canadian public funds, not Quebec public funds. And this funding for health for taxes paid by Quebecers are also used now to promote English language services in Quebec. And this is something that's been happening for years. And I think that the situation was even worse in the past, because supposedly because the Official Languages Act says that Anglophones are minorities in Quebec, and the people trying to promote French services in Quebec will say, well, they're not a minority, but we would be a majority if we were independent. And what has been done for Quebec French services, because Quebec is Francophones are a minority in Canada, and this is the best example of this situation. So, for example, $57 million for McGill University to invest in health care, which is a provincial jurisdiction. And there they didn't ask for the approval of the government of Quebec. And there is an agreement between Canada and Quebec to subsidize Anglophone education in Quebec, and that is an agreement between Canada and Quebec. That's not the subject that we're discussing here, but if we you give some for the Anglophones, you have to give the same thing for Francophones, for Francophone care, and we have to improve the situation of health transfers. And there are some provinces in Canada, in English Canada, that are don't want to increase assistance for Francophones, and I think they're really anti-Francophone, anti-French, because they don't want to support Francophone services even in Quebec. And thanks to the program of legal challenges under Law 101, this is something that has helped us defend Francophone services, and this is really an unfair situation. And I think this is an example of interference by the federal government in healthcare, as well as in other sectors like the public service. In the Official Languages Act, in measures adopted by every federal ministry, according to the Act, there must be a provision of services in English at all levels of government, and it's unbelievable. And if we look at the other side, the those who are defending Francophone services in Quebec don't have the same resources and funding. And I know people who have wanted to try and challenge the Official Languages Act based on Law 101, but that was rejected because the Official Languages Act shows that Quebecers are not a minority, an official minority in Quebec. And this is why the government of Quebec, when Ms. Lebel asked, the first condition must be to recognize that the two official languages in Canada, but only one is a minority language, only one is threatened. And so there a show of cooperation and speech from the throne referring to the need to support Francophone services. But when you look at the white paper, where we try and look at what might change with regard to minority languages, and we always look at French outside of Quebec and English in Quebec as minority languages. And there is so much pressure from the federal government. And I have a doctor who was a director of an establishment, and when he started to talk about that, he said that the Canadian government also every year requests information on what services we are providing in English. And Alliance Quebec, which was founded by the federal government to a great extent, and it's in their documentation that and after the election of the Parti Québécois, there was a regrouping of all the organizations, federal organizations in Quebec under Daniel Johnson, for example, at the time. And Quebecers were accused of racism for trying to defend the French language, and all these measures are related to the dominance of the Anglophone majority, and we have seen that Mr. Legault has had to fight against this disinformation in this area. And one of the major arguments of those who are against Bill 96, it will prevent Anglophones from having health services in English. And the most serious thing is that the federal government, along with these other organizations, McGill University, and I don't know, it's the rector of the university, but said that it's going to affect relationships between doctors and their patients. And I think that I don't know how many times there have been, or how long there are so many more services available in English in Canada, and so it's become difficult to find services in French for health in Canada. Point of order, Ms. Latienzo? Yes, thank you very much, Chair. And I'm listening to my colleague, and I'm sorry, but I think that he's going a bit outside the scope of our current discussion. And with regard to the amendment we're dealing with here, there are witnesses that are, or there's also information we've heard in other meetings, and I think he's going a bit beyond the subject of our current discussion. And there's an issue of provincial jurisdiction for health, and I think that we should limit ourselves to discussing the actual amendment. Thank you very much, Ms. Letasio. According to the rules, Mr. Beaulieu says that he's concerned with the date of 6 December, which is too early and doesn't give enough time for proper clause-by-clause consideration. And I think it's a very thin link to our subject because we've already discussed the first two amendments. I think I think that I will interpret the rules very generously, and it's true. I'm sure. I'd like to say that my colleague is having difficulty understanding, perhaps, what we're discussing. So go ahead. Go ahead on this amendment, sub-amendment 3. Sub-amendment 3, yes, and on the importance of having enough time to do a proper clause-by-clause consideration, because the law only refers to federal jurisdiction and the interference, in fact, of the federal government in the Quebec health system. And I think this is an argument, a major argument, and that means that, in fact, this is something that is relevant here. And I think the minister never really replied when we asked, what are you doing for French? No response from the minister. And we just heard, well, we recognize the importance of French and French services. And Mr. Corbet from Statistics Canada, we can see in the media where Statistics Canada is denying the decline of French, and during much of his career, he seemed to have a mandate to deny that French was declining. And today there is an article where in all the regions of Quebec there is a decline in the use of French, not as a maternal language or use at home, but as first official language spoken. And this is an article in the Devoir. And even if the open letter sent out that there was no reference really to maternal language, and the figures that I'm referring to, the language spoken at home, if it were referred to maternal language, the decline would be even worse. And Statistics Canada is another organization which is controlled by the federal government, and for years has tried to hide the truth, and it's now difficult to deny reality. And in Quebec, we have to be very watchful to avoid the decline. It's kind of like when you put a frog into a pot of cold water and then boil it slowly, then the frog doesn't jump out and doesn't realize what's happening to him. So the frog, has anything to do with something, some historical reference, or no? But I think there was a Franco-Ontarian has referred to this risk, and fortunately, Franco-Ontarians, just like the Acadians, are continuing to fight to defend their rights. But if we come back to this amendment, all these subsidies that are distributed to all kinds of organizations, even the QCGM, that group that accused us of being racist, that was funded by official languages and for access to justice in English, and the health program, health services in English, and they received $3 million, and that's added to the millions of dollars that they receive every year. So the federal government is working massively against French in Quebec, and that's what must concern Quebecers, and we can see that because with this kind of model of defending linguistic rights, wherever there's a minority, this effort is not succeeding, and I think that with regard to the federal government and the Official Languages Act more particularly, we have to get a clear response from the federal government and we provided a document on the needs that was provided to the minister, and the minister said that we have to have time to discuss this in the clause-by-clause consideration. And I think that that must happen. I think the rights of francophones everywhere to guarantee linguistic diversity throughout the world. I think this is essential. And what I wanted to say earlier, because I was interrupted, I'd like to hear the minister answer, and I would like to do that during discussion of the clause-by-clause. The minister, if I may, I'm talking about the Minister of Official Languages, but it's not all the ministers who are identified in paragraph 1 under Ms. Ashton's amendment. That has been dealt with, but I'm dealing with the clause by clause. But I'm just pointing out. I'd just like to recall that we had a discussion over We Charity. We had meetings where there's no discussion of substance, just procedure. And at that time, it was the Liberals that were refusing to discuss the actual topic. And I think that's was really filibustering. And what I'm doing is I'm taking advantage of I don't like this attempt to gag us and limit debate. Mr. Beaulieu is speaking about being gagged, and as I said earlier, the MP from Joliet, and confirmed by Mr. Beaulieu today, if the minister, the ministers came here, and yes, paragraph 1 of Ms. Ashton's sub-amendment, it's dealt with in the first paragraph. I'd like to come back to what Mr. Serres said. He can't, when there's been a point of order, he can't cite the MPs who might have made a statement in the House. That's not part of the rules. Yes, but you have to wait for the end of the sentence. Yes, but I can't. As chair, I want us to be in agreement, and I think I'm quite liberal in my interpretation. I think it's, for example, there's something that I said earlier. We have to deal with the topic that we're discussing, and if there is a point of order, you can start with a parenthesis and then go on to the actual substance of the point of order. I will allow the person to continue. And I recall a teacher once said that sometimes our students are a bit unruly, but we still like our unruly students, nevertheless. Go ahead. Yes, one of the impacts, before I was interrupted, it's hard to stay on track with my thoughts, but I think this is a rule. It's a part of the parliamentary rules, and I think this is something that allows greater democracy, but that provides a tool for the opposition to make itself heard and to defend its point of view. And I think from the point of view of Quebec, for 52 years, we haven't been heard as we should. And I think in the clause-by-clause discussion, it's going to be crucial to be able to deal fully with this topic. And the 6th of December, that won't give us much time. Which ministers will be able to have and how much time? We won't have time to discuss the topic fully. And saying that health is a provincial jurisdiction, well, yes, but I think there is nevertheless interference by the federal government in Quebec's jurisdiction for health. And I think this discussion is quite relevant. And I think for clause-by-clause consideration, we have to deal with these issues is also not only health, it's also access to justice. But I think the Minister of Justice was not even among the list of ministers we want to hear. But there are major problems as well. And there as well, it's the federal government that funds these various groups. And it's what I think is what I'd like to question the minister and the ministers about it, including the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
I'd like to hear from him. Because, these groups, Mr. Beaulieu, I have to stop you here. We've discussed this. We voted on it. We know, based on Ms. Ashton's sub-amendments, which ministers will come and for how long. I've warned you more than 3 times. If you'll allow me to finish my sentence, no, not this time. No, I can't let you finish your sentence. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Godin. I'd like to ask for the floor after. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I would like to borrow a phrase from my colleague to help us find our way, to help the cat find her kittens. I'd like to say this. We're on the sub-amendment moved by Ms. Ashton. We have meetings for 4 ministers that will last 1 hour prior to December 1st. I'd like to remind committee members that today is November 29th. This means that Thursday, we will be meeting 4 ministers and their officials for 1 hour each. That's impossible, Mr. Chair. I'd also like to say this. We're asking that amendments be tabled before December 2nd. We haven't heard from the ministers yet. So again, Mr. Chair, this is unrealistic. And now it says that we'll proceed with clause-by-clause consideration on December 6th. These are the sub-amendments moved by Ms. Ashton. I tabled amendments on November 1st to Mr. Serré's motion. And as you know, we have to move backwards. We first do the sub-amendments, then the amendment, and then the sub-amendments. Now, there are some points in Mr. Serré's motion that we talk about November 17th. And then that the clerk will send us the amendments by the 18th at noon. It also says that on November 22nd, we'll start the clause-by-clause consideration. I'd like to tell you again, we're already on the 29th. And then on point 5, if the committee has not completed the clause-by-clause consideration of the bill by noon on December 1st, we will stop the debate and move to the consideration amendment by amendment without debate. Now, Mr. Chair, I am willing to withdraw my amendments with unanimous consent so that we can move forward on this. Because again, Mr. Chair, what's happening here, there's party politics. Everyone's pointing fingers and accusing each other of filibustering and not me and it's him, etc. And things are not working. And I cannot believe that we're still talking about this. This is the 7th meeting we've dedicated to this discussion since Mr. Serré tabled his motion. And I would like unanimous consent for 2 things. 1, unanimous consent to withdraw my amendments. That's my first request. And I'll be transparent with you, Mr. Chair. I said last week, I extended a hand to the other side. I want to get to the bottom of this situation because it is inefficient. My second request that requires unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, is that I'd like us to work as a subcommittee. I'm so sorry, Mr. Godin. I was discussing your first proposal about the technical issues. My second suggestion, my second request, is to seek unanimous consent from the committee. This is something I did last meeting as well. I would like the subcommittee to get together with one representative from each party to work together to find our way out of this, to find some common ground, and to make sure that French wins out. out of this situation. So these are my two requests for unanimous consent, Mr. Chair. Okay, well, we have a technical issue regarding your first request. Unanimous consent is an easy thing that we can do. It's a bit of a gray zone, but we can't withdraw an amendment that already has sub-amendments. I'll give the floor to Ms. Ashton as she asked to speak about this. Ms. Ashton, what do you think? We would like to wait. First, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be here in person. I finally be able to have some of the sandwiches that I see you eating on screen. So thanks to the personnel who prepared these. It's a pleasure to see you all. But I would like to reiterate this. We still stand behind the sub-amendments that we've moved. Our message is clear. We want to move forward and build a better bill. We want to improve C13. I'm concerned about the fact that the door is closing on this. We respect everyone's right to share their opinion and their point of view, but these are the sub-amendments that we've moved, and they're based on a desire to move forward with this bill and to improve it as soon as possible. And another point about your first request, Mr. Godin, I would say that you've requested this unanimous consent twice, and it was denied twice. So it's out of order, really. But about your second point was that the committee should be able to, if the official subcommittee of the standing committee could meet to discuss. Do we have unanimous consent? Before we move to that, I'd like to respond to what my colleague said. I understand what she's saying, and my objectives are the same. I'd like us to move forward. Some of her sub-amendments were approved, but we're talking about December 1st in some of these sub-amendments. Mathematically, it doesn't work, Mr. Chair. We cannot respect this motion. So I'm just seeking for us to agree on common sense. Let's put party politics aside. Let's find some common ground. Once again, I'm extending an olive branch. I was talking about my notice of motion on November 10th. That was talking about the number of meetings, and we're getting stuck in dates, and we keep going around in circles, and it's not working. Who is this benefiting? I'm asking the question again, Mr. Chair. I invite you to ask the members of the committee to seek unanimous consent to either do this or to work as a subcommittee to find a solution, or any other productive proposal that would allow us to protect French and improve C13. I think this is very important, Mr. Chair, because we've compromised. We've reduced the number of witnesses we'd hear from. We've shortened the testimony window, but we did win one thing. We got to hear from the Minister of Heritage, but we won't be able to hear from him because he has to come here by December 1st. The officials aren't available. They haven't even been invited. So I would like to implore all of the members of the committee to work together to find a solution so that we could actually start working on improving Bill C13. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't repeat what I said about your first request, but your second request about unanimous consent would be to have the subcommittee meet. Is that correct? I have a point of clarification, Mr. Chair. Yes, go ahead. I want to understand what my colleague is saying. If we all withdraw our amendments with unanimous consent, we would then meet as a subcommittee? Nothing stops members from discussing outside of our meetings. Currently, there's filibustering going on at Public Safety, at Canadian Heritage. I'm not blaming my colleague, but it seems to be there's an order from the top about filibustering because nothing is moving. So, yes, we can find an agreement. What I suggest is before we remove these amendments, we agree on a way to proceed. And then if we all agree on that, maybe then Ms. Ashton will withdraw her sub-amendments and Mr. Godin can withdraw his amendments and we'll withdraw the motion, because otherwise we're just going around in circles. Okay, I'm trying to understand what you're saying, Mr. Drouin. I think it's important. Mr. Godin, it is related to what you are requesting. But, Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what Mr. Drouin has proposed. He's saying the committee would meet outside of a committee meeting, outside of an official meeting time? No, but I'm just saying that nothing stops Mr. Serré and Mr. Godin from discussing without doing it in the formal meeting setting. Can we find an agreement before entering a formal meeting and we can discuss the dates then? And of course, we would invite Mr. Beaulieu and Ms. Ashton. If everyone can compromise and find an agreement, that's interesting. What we're concerned about is not just this meeting, it's everything else that's going on. Mr. Godin? Well, you know, Mr. Chair, with all of the respect I have for my colleague opposite, I don't accept what he's saying about our intentions here at Official Languages. I've always demonstrated that I'm committed to this cause. I do not accept that he is accusing us as the Conservative Party from having instructions coming from the top. Mr. Chair, I could do the same for him. I don't want to start playing this game. Again, my objective is to find a solution. I think Mr. Drouin's suggestion could be relevant, but I think we should do it as a subcommittee and that it appears in the record. I can assure you, all members of the Liberal Party, that I am acting in good faith. We have not received an order from the top, and it's a privilege for me to represent the official languages in the shadow cabinet, and I have received no instructions from the top to act in bad faith. Mr. Chair, I'll give the floor to Ms. Ashton, then we'll move on. I'll tell you what I think, and we'll try and see if we can find a solution. Ms. Ashton, I thought Mr. Beaulieu was before me. Mr. Beaulieu, did you want to speak about this point? Because you also have the floor after. I want to speak again after, but I do have something to say about this. I'm trying to understand something. I don't quite get what Mr. Drouin is proposing. He's proposing an informal discussion to find the outline of a solution because he's worried that if we meet as a subcommittee, that we won't get to the bottom of it. I'm trying to understand what he's saying. We'll have informal discussions in camera. I don't understand what his intentions are. He's suggesting that we meet outside of the official committee meeting hours. That the whole committee meet outside of the committee like a subcommittee of the whole? If I can clarify, yes, this is something we do with other committees. You know, we have 2 hours here where we can argue about one point or another, but nothing stops us. You know, there seems to be olive branches being extended on both sides, so maybe it would be a good way to get to the bottom of this. Maybe we can agree before we get to the unanimous consent to withdraw motions and amendments. And it'll be easier to do that because if we're all going to withdraw our sub-amendments, amendments, and motions without an agreed-upon solution, we won't be any further off. You know, I cannot stand to limit this debate. We've accepted a lot. We had a first in-camera meeting where we accepted a number of meetings. This brought us up to February because of the break month after the holidays. Then we accepted to scale back to December 6th. And then a motion came and changed that agreement. And then the last time we opened the door to opposition, to the governing party to propose ours, and that was rejected. So if there's no true willingness to compromise and allow a real debate on the clause-by-clause consideration, it'll be very difficult, regardless of the format. But if there is goodwill and a desire to discuss, I have a point of order also, but I want to come back to what... No, I just want to talk about this now, but before going to Ms. Ashton, I would like to say that last week we had talked about the idea of meeting as a subcommittee. I did some investigating. So again, this is an official subcommittee meeting with all of the staff and interpreters. It's not really possible to do this before the holidays because of the lack of resources. It's almost noon. Maybe we can do it during this meeting and to meet in an official capacity. Ms. Ashton. That's what I was going to request. Is it realistic to have a subcommittee meeting? Because we've been trying to find extra time and resources to meet more often, and it's been very difficult. I think theoretically it's a great idea. There are some sub-amendments to be considered. We did this to try and find a way to get the work done before the holidays. I would like us to move to a vote on these sub-amendments. I don't know if we'll have time to do that today, but I'm open to the idea of having a subcommittee meeting as well. Well, that being said, Mr. Godin, did you want to add something? You know, Mr. Chair, I will withdraw my first request. Let's suspend all of the sub-amendments, amendments, and motion, and let's have unanimous consent to meet as a subcommittee to try and get untangled here, because we're losing time. I think if we want to be good, act in good faith, I think we should adjourn this meeting, meet as a subcommittee. Unfortunately, we'll have to excuse the members who are not part of the subcommittee, but I do think that this is what's in the best interest of the parliamentary process and the Official Languages Act. Indeed, yes, the subcommittee exists for this type of situation. I'd like to mention to the people who might be watching that I took the time to investigate whether or not it would be possible for the subcommittee to meet outside of official meeting hours, but it's not possible because of a lack of resources. If there's unanimous consent, I'm prepared to propose the following: to meet as a subcommittee right now. Mr. Beaulieu, did you want to speak about that? I think that that's a good idea. I think worst case, if it's informal, it might even be more effective. It's an alternative that the subcommittee meets informally. Either way, I don't see what the big difference is between formal or informal is. Well, there's a big difference in terms of, well, there won't be meeting minutes, but if the goal is to trap each other, yes, we need minutes. But if the goal is to work together, I don't see why we wouldn't meet informally. But what you proposed, I like it. Maybe we could provide another alternative. After hearing all of that, Ms. Latanzio, did you want to say something? Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Inaudible to the interpreter. Do we have a date for this meeting, if such a meeting would take place? We would adjourn immediately. From what I understood, it seems that we're agreeing. We would adjourn this meeting now, and the last hour of our official time would be the subcommittee meeting. So this committee will turn into a subcommittee meeting. Yes, with the official members of the subcommittees. So it would be one representative that's been predetermined for each party, along with the chair, myself. Thank you.
Donc, est-ce que je suggère?
So I would suggest that we adjourn. No, suspend, not adjourn. Suspend. No. One moment, please. We're going to adjourn, and I've noted where we were before adjourning, and we were. I would come back to Mr. Beaulieu. Yes, Mr. Serre. Yes, I want to confirm with the clerk that the difference between suspend or adjourn. Suspend that poses technical problems, the same problems we always have. So I'm going to begin again as if we had suspended. It's an issue of length of video, change of rooms, etc. It's really a practical issue for those who are listening to us. But we would go back to discussion where we left off. If there's no agreement, we would go back to where Mr. Beaulieu was discussing the third amendment from Ms. Ashton. So it's possible we could come back with the report of the committee with an efficient timeline. Thank you very much for your suggestion. I think that maybe we could add a new word to parliamentary vocabulary, a technical adjournment. And I would suggest then when we go into subcommittee immediately, raise your hands if you're against this issue. So we're going to adjourn. I adjourn this meeting on the same conditions as the last one. We will come back afterwards as if we had just suspended. For technical reasons, we are adjourning and we are now meeting in subcommittee.